Thank you, Handyman. And let's go.
Okay. So my name is Arnaud Lauret. I'm an architect at AXA Bank. It's a French bank. I work mainly on APIs for web and mobile projects. And on my spare time, as you said, I share my ideas, experiments, and concerns about API as the API Handyman on Twitter. As you may have noticed, this will be Star Wars film. But rest assured that there will be no Star Wars 7 spoilers. So, let's go. Yes. Today, I want to share with you a dream. I believe that this dream is not only my dream, but also the dream of many people in the API community. This dream is a Document-API-topia, an ideal world where API and documentation live in a perfect harmony. But what makes documentation so critical in APIs? Episode 1, the syncresis makes so more or less engulf the API loss. People are struggling with API documentation, and an anonymous hangs over them. But first and foremost, documentation is not only end-user documentation. Like Star Wars merchandising, documentation can take many forms and have many different audiences, from functional requirements, technical requirements, marketing and advertising documents, API descriptors, error messages, code snippets, deployment documentation, installation guides, screenshots, design guidelines, RFCs, forums, stack overflow, books, use cases, user stories, interactive documentation, and so many others. Documentation is every instruction, comment, and information needed to build, maintain, and use an API in subsystem. An API is not only an interface, it's also a software. And there are probably many other software that runs behind it. And all this needs to be documented. All this needs to be documented for the people who build it, the people who run it, and the people who use it. API and documentation are not complete strangers to each other. Like Luke and Leia, they are related. Sorry for the people who don't have seen each other like that. And we can even say that API and documentation are more than related. You need documentation to build, maintain, and use your API. You can build part of your documentation from your API. You can build part of your API from documentation. And of course, documentation wouldn't exist without this API. API and documentation are completely intertwined. API and documentation have a symbiotic relationship. What is a symbiotic relationship? What is symbiosis? Symbiosis is a close and often long-term interaction between two different species. Symbiosis is often reduced to its most known form, mutualism. And so and Chewbacca have that kind of relationship. Mutualism is a relationship between two individuals of different species who have both individuals' benefits. But mutualism is not the only form of symbiosis. Jar Jar Binks and Star Wars have a symbiotic relationship. It's called parasitism. A parasitic relationship is one in which one member of the association benefits while the other is harmed. Do I really need to explain who is harmed in the Jar Jar Binks Star Wars relationship? No. Darth Vader and the Emperor also have a symbiotic relationship. It's called syncresis. Syncresis is a type of symbiosis in which the two individuals involved are harmed. deliverables this interaction is detrimental to both deliverables. Darth Vader and the Emperor killed each other at the end of Return of the Jedi, so people don't see it. So in the API case, API and documentation symbiotic relationship can take two forms: synchronous and mutual. Pull documentation needs to pull API that nobody uses. Pull API needs to pull documentation that nobody uses. API and documentation will succeed together or fall to the dark side when nobody uses them. But what could we do? What could we do in an ideal world to ensure that API and documentation have a mutually symbiotic relationship? What could we do in an ideal world to be sure that API and documentation is in a perfect harmony? Episode 2, Attack of the Unread. Unread documentation. There are so many of them, and it can be dangerous sometimes. People don't read documentation because some documentation shouldn't have been written. Some of it can be wrong, others are too hard to read, too hard to understand, too long, not adapted to the audience, not adapted to the context. In Document-API-topia, unread documentation is a long forgotten myth. In order to avoid unread documentation, only the right people write the right documentation for the right audience and the right context. It means that creating documentation is a real job. Creating documentation needs qualified people with different skills depending on the type of documentation you want to create. It means that documentation is created only when really needed. Do you need documentation to use a computer maps? It means that documentation is adapted to what is documented. You will not make the same type of documentation when you want to document a protocol or mobile. It means that documentation is adapted to the audience. APIs and user and provider needs documentation, but not the same. Beginners and power users don't need the same documentation. And everybody don't learn new things the same way. Some people are more visual, others oral, verbal, physical, logical. We need to find the right way to provide that documentation. It means that documentation is adapted to the context, adapted to when and how people use documentation. In order to avoid unread documentation, in Document-API-topia, everything is standardized. Having standardized APIs system will lessen the need for documentation. If you build your REST APIs always the same way, using the same manner to use HTTP verbs, HTTP status, the same patterns for path construction, you only need to expect it once. Not like people easily find what your API is for. Having standardized documentation will also help you, because if you use common and shared structure of templates, but also shared concepts and vocabularies, you will lessen the effort to write, read, and understand documentation. In order to avoid unread documentation, everything is micronized. The use of microservices is widely adopted, but the concepts of microservices also have been adapted in the documentation to give usable, reusable, maintainable, and replaceable micro-documentation. In order to avoid unread documentation, everything is analyzed and tracked. Documentation can depend on standard guidelines or other documentation. There are automated systems that ensure that each documentation is consistent with its dependencies. And these automated systems can update inconsistent documentation successfully. Documentation and its subject, what is documented, is constantly tracked to check that they are consistent with each other, and if necessary, they are updated. each published documentation is constantly tracked to measure its usage, and users can also provide feedback. With all these statistics and feedbacks, we can improve documentation. And finally, every single documentation is referenced and accessible easily. No need to crawl Google for days to find the information you need. But how could such prodigies exist in Document-API-topia? Episode 3, Revenge of the Code. In our API does, writing, maintaining, and providing consistent and up-to-date documentation is definitely not an easy task. In Document-API-topia, everything is done easily because documentation is treated as code. Documentation is written using structured text, human machine readable. These structured documents can be easily compiled or transformed into any other format usable by human and machine readers, just like code. Every documentation is stored within a version control system. This system, of course, allows the creation of documents, but also proposes collaboration tools. When you code, you don't reinvent the wheel. You use existing libraries or modules. Nowadays, we use things such as NPM, origins, pip to handle all these dependencies. In Document-API-topia, when you write documentation, it's the same. There is something called the DPM, the Documentation Package Manager, which helps you to write documentation just like to write software. You can search for existing documentation with the DPM search, such as guidelines, dictionaries, RFCs, templates. The DPM will create a descriptor containing all documentation dependencies. This descriptor will also contain all the links between the documentation and what is documented. And based on this descriptor, it's very easy to check that the documentation is consistent with its dependencies, whether these dependencies are documentation or the documented subject itself. And the DPM can automatically update the documentation of the subject, depending on the context if it finds inconsistency. All these raw text documentation can be used as a source material to generate different types of content, such as ebooks, PDFs, websites, interactive documentations, and many other things. And documentation can be used as a source material to generate software. Of course, code can also be used to generate documentation. People who write documentation use an IDE, an integrated documentation environment, providing all these tools. And all these tools are also orchestrated within the DCD system, the documentation continuous delivery, which will also publish new or updated documentation in collaboration with the classic software continuous delivery to deliver documentation at the right time. Code, structured documentation, and machine-readable documentation. All these enable complex possibilities. Episode 4, New Data. In our API bus, we are struggling to provide new ways of representing documentation to allow people to use and understand easily and quickly provided APIs or software. In Document-API-topia, this is not a concern anymore. There are thousands of ways of providing documentation, easily understandable. By treating documentation as code, documentation became machine readable. This structured and machine readable documentation enables the use of documentation as data. And when you have data, what do? Okay, everybody's sleeping. You create APIs. You can create documentation API. And with this documentation data and API, you enable the creation of outrageously beautiful, usable, and useful documentation visualization. And as we know with the API descriptor overlays between the documentation and what is documented, you can create really interactive documentation visualization. A documentation fully connected to what it documents in real time. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, an interactive documentation visualization is worth 1,000,000,000 words. Documentation, and especially end-user documentation, is not only about machines, data, and full computer graphics. Episode 5, Human Strikes Back. In our APIs, we forget sometimes that documentation is made by people, for people. In Document-API-topia, even if documentation is managed within a huge automatic system, people are its very heart. People produce documentation, and most important, people use documentation. Have you ever seen this Lego Star Wars Death Star? Who thinks that you need less than 2,000 pieces to build this Death Star? Raise your hand. Who thinks that you need more than 2,000 pieces to build it? You need exactly 3,349 pieces to build it. 138 different types of pieces. What if I only give you a list of pieces to build it? Will you build it easily and happily? No, you will stop really. That's why in the API verse, only providing a simple API descriptor, a simple list of endpoints, a simple list of breaks is unthinkable. An API descriptor is not the documentation, it's only a part of it. That's why in Document-API-topia, documentation, and especially end-user one, are written like stories. Documentation storytellers use writing, but also audio, video, visualization to be more or less interactive documentation. Stories, depending on the context. Documentation can be an ebook, a static website, a complex visualization, a webinar, or even a video game. This documentation, even if they are complex, are also ended within the documentation package. Documentation continuous delivery system, like any of them. Like even easy to produce, publish, maintain. I said earlier that people don't all learn the same way. Some people like to see things, some people like to hear. Some people are logic. We are end users, we are providers, we are beginners, we are power users. In this ideal world, anyone can have a type and level of documentation he wants when he wants, from quick start guide to complete references, from ruler text to complex documentation. One size of documentation does not fit all. There are so many documentations and so many APIs. How can people find their way? Episode 6, Return of the Meta. In our API work, we are struggling to find information and documentation. In Document-API-topia, what we want easy. With hyper documentation, APIs can provide in-context documentation. By using the power of hypermedia, APIs can provide links to documentation. And by using the power of content negotiation, APIs can provide documentation to improve a certain operation. For example, with the application JSON plus documentation, the API will return the classic data, but also documentation metadata in one payload. With documentation, tutorial is beautiful when you call an endpoint. you will have video tutorial in return. And in Document-API-topia, each system must provide a standard meta documentation descriptor. This descriptor includes information such as API locations, API documentation locations, pricing limits. In a nutshell, it will be every useful information or link that will help people discover and use the system. But this is a totally awesome brief, but I will go. Episode 7, final one, the API loss awakens. Those are API bugs can achieve API-topia. Is this dream totally impossible? I don't think so. I truly believe in this dream. Of course, some part of it may stay a dream fantasy, but I believe that there are the seeds already here in this world to create this ideal world. There are already so many tools, formats, concepts that would help building this world. There are so many people with many ideas about that. So this ideal world is within reach, and it's up to us to make it real and create a world where API and documentation will achieve a mutual symbiotic relationship. A real world where API and documentation will live in a perfect harmony. So, thank you very much. And may the documentation be with your API always.
So we're going to time, so please come on stage, like we will have a question sessions.